Ernie, since it was first published in 1979, your book, Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous, has been the definitive history of AA. How did your research into the AA Fellowship begin?
It really happened by coincidence. You know what they say in AA about coincidence, of course. I began graduate school in psychology and started getting curious about where these ideas originated, came from, mixed, and I started asking questions. They said, go audit a history course. Well, I hated history. I was in college, you know, dates and battles, and I found out, this is the University of Rochester, that there's a history of ideas. And this marvelous professor of medieval history, Marvin Becker, I was in his class, and I just got excited. And so I applied in graduate schools then to go on, not in psychology, but in history further. And I got accepted at Harvard, among other places, and in the History of American Civilization program. And I studied the history of ideas at that point in the late 60s, early 70s. Urban history was the thing, what was going on in the cities, if you recall, people were very interested in. So I started studying the city of Cleveland, Ohio. I'd never been there, never visited there, did not live there, therefore no implicit knowledge. So Oscar Handlin, my mentor, was sort of excited about this, and I started studying Cleveland. And I was looking, it just couldn't hold together. And I started looking for groups of people that gathered not based on ethnicity or on religion and some kind of, we didn't have the concept then, I don't think, of self-help mutual aid groups. Someone told me that AA had begun in Cleveland, and I had a cop who said, will he take me to meetings? He went to meetings. Well, and I started hearing these things that I knew couldn't be true, like that AA came out of the Oxford movement, which was in 19th century Anglican. I mean, just it didn't fit. And so I went back to Cambridge and started going to some other AA meetings and again, hearing these things that I couldn't explain and sort of on the side began looking at them. And the Cleveland dissertation sort of fell apart. And I forget who I was talking to exactly, but this was 1975 by this time. Bill Wilson had died in 1971. I had never heard the name. I didn't know who he was. I guess I'd heard his name mentioned at AA. And they said that they were putting together their archives and that, you know, Bill's letters were being organized. And this sounded very interesting. And so I made a few inquiries through Dan Anderson at Hazelden, and I found out that exactly, AA was putting together its archives, and Nell Wing, who had been Bill's secretary for many years, was the archivist, and this is a history graduate student's dream, a trove of letters of a significant person that no one else has ever seen.
And a movement that no book has been written on.
And, well, I didn't even think of it as a movement at that time. It was sort of a curiosity. And so I applied. Dan Anderson told me how to apply, write the GSO and the trustees, and there are two academics, George Gordon and Milton Maxwell, on the Trustees Archives Committee, and I went and met them, and we got along very well. And they gave me access. And I mean, it was just incredible. Nell was arranging them strictly chronologically, all of Bill's letters. She'd never had any training as an archivist. She was a secretary. She'd begun in AA as a temp. I mean, really have to read her book to understand her story. Marvelous. And so one of the first things I did was suggest that Nell be sent to graduate school, at least for the summer, in archival studies, and she came back. And so I was on the ground floor of organizing these, and I kept seeing these letters. And by this time, I'm totally into this. I mean, Cleveland had gone by the way, and I just got into this. It was a different world then. I mean, when it got very hot in Cambridge, I'd sort of go up in New England and on day trips and haunt the book barns, and I'd see these first edition big books on the shelf of used bookstores for 50 cents, 75 cents, and I didn't bother buying them. I had a copy of that book, Alcoholics Anonymous. In fact, I had a newer edition, and I know first edition was important, but that was available to me in the A archive. So, I mean, I could have been rich if I bought with what those books go for these days. But I just totally lucked into the topic at a point where there wasn't this interest in AA, and Not God got published at a time just as this interest was burgeoning, and I think maybe helped it along somewhat by being available. But again, it was luck, or in the AA understanding, coincidence.
Yeah. How did your view of AA and the co-founders in particular change through your research?
That's sort of interesting. I think I had an advantage. The little that I knew of Bill Wilson, I didn't like him. He'd been a Wall Street hanger-on runner. He wasn't really a broker even. Did some nice investigative work, but he clearly worshipped rich people and loved capitalism and thought that Franklin Roosevelt was betraying America. And if we'd met, I'm sure he wouldn't have liked me. You know, here's this pointy-headed Harvard intellectual who thinks he's so smart. And so I began going through the letters, looking for intellectual threads and everything. It was sort of this background impression of, you know, this is this guy who, you know, fundamentally, from my Cambridge perspective, was probably a jerk. But yeah. And I'm not sure when, but I was faithfully going through the letters. I wasn't looking at anything else. I was setting up interviews, but first there was the immersion in the letters. And somewhere, probably before the 1,000th letter, reading the responses, people would write Bill about their concerns and their problems, and I slowly began to recognize the deep understanding and compassion of this man. He obviously could read between the lines of the letters sent to him. I'd read a letter that he received, and then I'd go to his and say, well, what's he responding to? I'd go, I hadn't even noticed it in that letter. And here I had trained in psychology. And also his compassion. Yeah. And the other thing, his humility. He had this streak of grandiosity, of thinking he was great, wanting to be on top, with which I could easily identify, but he knew it and he kept shooting himself down. He was sort of made fun of his own, there I go again type thing, and which I think has been one of the saving graces in AA. Because Bill probably was in a position to be a charismatic leader and one of these dynamic people who had cults eventually, and his recognition of his own flaw and his tendency to grandiosity, I think is tremendously significant in preserving AA from. Bill will talk about big shotism, and his awareness of it. So I learned, of course, Nell was guiding us along. Nell was, virtually worshipped Bill, and I was wondering, at the beginning why. And I slowly came to understand why. It's obviously. Nell did not have a great deal of formal education, but she had a great sensitivity, and the fact that this person so impressed her also guided me. But
I remember at one point you saying that one of Bill Wilson's greatest contributions was that he saved AA from himself, which I thought was very...
Exactly. Yes. Well, he said that. That's not my original thing. Yeah. He said that. I saved AA from myself. It's one of his... I don't think it was in a Grapevine article, actually, but maybe it was in a private letter, and as Bill sees it. But yeah. It's amazing because one of the uniquenesses of AA is precisely that it didn't become what all these other things began, both before and after.
You've also talked about the chemistry of the co-founders at times in some of your writings and the unique combinations of what Dr. Bob and Bill both brought together in terms of that founding process.
It's interesting. They're both Vermonters, and as you know, in Susan Cheever's book, she develops this point because it is significant that both co-founders came from Vermont, and we have some stereotypes of Vermonters, but Dr. Bob, he was a surgeon. He went to medical school and became a surgeon, and surgeons work on one person at a time, and they don't have a lot of outside interest especially, and they're very focused, and then this is very good. I guess that's important to be a surgeon. Bill is this glad hander. He is making a living on Wall Street because he's able to read people, and he's able, he traveled around with Lois and a motorcycle at the General Electric in Schenectady, and hanging out with the guys in the bar, was able to understand, sort of figure out what was going on in the plant that he could report back to those who are going to invest, and so Bill was this glad hander, and it's amazing. These two people, if they met in a bar, wouldn't have even looked at each other. I mean, you cannot think, not that Dr. Bob did that much bar drinking, of course. Most of his surgeons don't usually drink in public, but they had nothing in common, despite their common roots. Nothing in common in the way in which their temperaments and personality developed. And again, Bob's great contribution: keep it simple. Keep it simple on Bill's pull away. I think, I forget who first came up with this, that, if it had only been Bill Wilson, AA would have more franchises than McDonald's, and if it had been only Dr. Bob, AA would be operating out of a Carvel stand in Akron. And the leavening impact of these two on each other, even to the point of the tension between Akron and New York, which goes on to this point, goes back to that divergence in the co-founders, and in the midst of that divergence, there's tremendous respect for each other.
Yeah.
This is the amazing thing that, you know, we talk about people in early sobriety, you know, well, they only have 1 year or something like that, or you know, these were two people who were just months dry.
Yeah.
Who developed this profound respect for each other that I think if you ask somebody today, they'd say, well, yeah, maybe after 5 or 6 years sobriety. I'm like, yeah, it was just again, as I was doing this study and hearing these comments, because I was going to AA meetings to, you know, hear how this was developing, it was so striking. Yeah.
Yeah. When you pulled this scholarly history together, or the real founding moments of the AA movement, in some ways, this was the first scholarly treatment of such depth of AA. What was the response of both the AA community and the professional community to the book?
It's really interesting. I wasn't writing a book. I was writing a dissertation. And, you know, if you write a dissertation, you're writing it for 3 to 5 people, because that's, you know, you want those letters after your name and you want to get a job. And after I received the degree in 1978, of course, Hazelden expressed interest. My Oscar Handlin wanted to see it published. He thought it was a good study, and that always helps. And I sort of went with Hazelden because they said they would keep it in print, whereas commercial publishers wouldn't. I'm very glad that I made that choice, because they have kept it in print. And at first, even when I was doing the research, the archives were on a different floor than the General Service Office. And the people in the General Service Office at the various desks, they sort of didn't, I was an intruder. And, you know, they're very generous. If any ordinary AA walks in, they're that person's servant. They're marvelous. But I wasn't, you know, I wasn't there, a member. And I was there as a researcher. And I didn't have much occasion to go, but I felt, I got the cold shoulder. Yeah. And Nell, of course, was very warm, and this was okay. I mean, you know, you're doing research, you don't necessarily need to be loved. You try to do research. And so I did the dissertation. I gave a copy to Lois and submitted a copy, and we went through the process of becoming a book manuscript, and Milton Maxwell, who by that time was the head of the trustees, called me, and he said, you know, Ernie, you mentioned in the book that Bill's experimentation with LSD. He said, and the other trustees have asked me if you would cut that from the book. And he said, you know, we had the agreement in your dissertation. There's can't be prior censorship, but now this is not the dissertation. You're going to book publication. Yeah. And I said, wow. And I went to my academic mentors, Oscar Handlin and Bill Hutchison, and I said, you know, this is what I've been asked, and out of respect for AA, I don't want to do something that would be injurious to them. But on the other hand, as I told them, was I don't think anything I do can injure AA. I mean, it's when I was asked that question. But especially Oscar Handlin, well, both of them said, this is part of your story. The way in which you treat this is that Bill's thirst for alcohol became a thirst for alcoholics. This explains it. This thirst at times took weird expressions, and that's part of your story. And so I gritted my teeth and prayed over it and decided to leave it in the book. And so when the book was published, they were obviously holding their breath at 468 Park Avenue South, was where GSO was then. And from what I heard, I mean, I wasn't exactly holding my breath. I was looking for a job at that point. The first 300 calls that they got to New York were people saying how wonderful the book is. It doesn't make Bill into a tin god or some kind of a saint. We see Bill and all of his flaws, and this is such a wonderful description. And of course, since AA is the fellowship, the members, and the people at GSO take seriously the idea that they're the servants of the membership. When the membership responded that way, they were so happy. Yeah. And then I could visit the AA, and they were nice to me at the desk when I'd stop by the office. And in the professional world, there's some advantages to going to Harvard. I mean, this was a dissertation approved at Harvard University by one of the leading American historians of all time, Oscar Handlin, and it was. I mean, it's a good dissertation. I worked hard, and it was good. And the fact that it was, I had no problems at all. I did have, you know, some question, well, why didn't we hear about this sooner? I mean, it has this depth to it, and my response was this, Nobody studied it before, and that's in part because these documents became available at this time, and I was the fortunate one to do it.
My sense is the depth of the book created almost a means of connection between AA and the professional community. Was that kind of an intent or an unanticipated side effect from the book?
It wasn't an intent. Well, I guess it was in the back of my mind at times. It bothered me as I was doing my research, and also I was researching alcoholism to understand something about what this is about. And it struck me that professionals and members of AA didn't trust each other and didn't like each other much. And this sort of bothered me because I knew good people in both camps.
Yeah.
And so I didn't aim the book that way, but I think from that point, I think my whole career professionally has been aimed at bridging that gap. These are people who speak two different languages. And the language of recovery, the language of which is basically a language of spirituality, this is different from the professional language, which comes from the disciplines and the sciences. And there are wonderful, caring people in both places. And the alcoholic doesn't have too many people who care for him. I mean, alcoholics in their drunkenness are not very attractive people. And, but so these, I mean, if anybody's in this field, they are compassionate people.
Right.
You know, back in those days especially, there wasn't any money in this field. And I think that my greatest joy in my years of going around and presenting and teaching, I'd go into a strange city and go into a hall to a presentation, and it would be half professionals and half alcoholics, and they'd AA members. They'd usually be sitting at opposite sides. I mean, it was a very literal separation. and you know, I'd walk in and they'd be talking to each other and they'd be talking to each other. And if when I left, they were talking back and forth, I knew that I had been a success. I mean, this was the, I saw myself as a bridge builder. In fact, Oscar Hanlon called me that once.
Right.
I felt so much that these two caring communities needed to be more respectful, needed to really know each other, not just go by the superficial stuff.
Yeah. I'm wondering if, as you think back in terms of the development of AA, could AA have occurred any time other than when it did?
Oh dear. This is my bias as a historian, I guess, but you know, the beginning of the book, 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, discussing step 1 when Bill talks about being bankrupt. AA, I think, could have only come out of the American 1930s. After the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression taking effect, for the first time, this go-get-'em, optimistic American culture hit bottom. Yeah. You know, here were these people who had been titans of business and doing very well, and suddenly they were rummaging. They were rummaging through garbage pails outside of restaurants, and the restaurants were cooking food even though there was no one there. There was this trying to put on this illusion that everything's okay when really it wasn't. And this suffused the culture. 1929 was to the United States what 1914 was to Europe. The outbreak of World War I and the Great Crash, you know, the end of this idea of all we have is ongoing progress. And as Europe suffered this with the outbreak of World War I, we didn't that much. World War I didn't mean that much here. In fact, we entered and rather quickly the war was won by the side that we joined on. And so if anything, the 20s were very optimistic and very, you know, triumphalistic even. And the 1930s, I mean, the Great Depression, people were depressed, really. It was... the culture hit bottom. People who had been used to controlling things learned that they were powerless. Yeah. And I think it was this clash really that first discovered AA, that level of business, people who had to confront their powerlessness. So to me, AA could have only come out of the American 1930s. Yeah. I'm sure other historians would bring different perspectives, but I see it so much as coming out of that era. I mean, this is the era out of which neo-Orthodox thought comes in the theology that goes on to the Niebuhrs, the recognition of powerlessness. Right. There are other threads that go on at this time. This is the culture of the moment, and AA is born in this, and it takes its early nourishment from it.
Yeah, if I'm thinking of the 1935 to 1939 period when the experiential building blocks of the steps are going to come into place. You know, what are the elements that came together in those, in this crystallization of the steps, and kind of what do they tell us about recovery?
The acceptance of powerlessness and the importance of honesty are the two things that come out especially. I think that those are the two ideas, and then honesty with self and honesty with others. So, you know, you see the inventory. I mean, the steps supposedly were derived from practices of the Oxford Group, and directly were. But one reason the Oxford Group was flourishing at that point is it's in the same culture that had begun in a different one. And so this emphasis on recognizing powerlessness, admitting the fact there's nothing you could do about this directly. Being honest with oneself and others, because clearly, you know, some of the great moguls, Samuel Insull, the great utilities mogul, is in jail for lying. And suddenly they, you know, the reason that business collapsed, business is based on trust, and suddenly the trust had been betrayed. And, you know, people had money in the banks they thought were secure, and the bank doors were locked, and there wasn't any federal deposit insurance in those days, and people lost their savings. And so the importance then of honesty, you know, became highlighted. And I think those are the two most powerful elements that come through in on that page, How It Works in the AA Big Book. I think the word honest appears 5 times. Yeah. That's those two things, I think.
Yeah. You know, I'm wondering, we've both referenced in some of our writings the many pre-AA recovery mutual aid societies, most of which didn't survive their founding generation. What do you see as the real key to AA's survival and thriving when so many of its predecessors did not?
I think that question might be beyond a historian's reach. I mean, there are things that can be pointed to. The uniqueness at AA, I think, is the vulnerability of its leaders and their recognition of their own vulnerability. I mean, I think both Bill and Dr. Bob realized that they were one drink away from another drunk. Yeah. And Dr. Bob supposedly had the craving all the time, which is why the craving didn't leave Bob, at least until very late in his life. He died in 1950, but at least in 1948, he talked about the craving. Right. And so the only way by going out and working with another alcoholic, a 12-step call, if you want to call it that. Bill, who did not have this craving experience, and I think it's very ironic that now apparently on his deathbed, in sort of a delirium, he asked for drinks. Some people have said, "Oh, how terrible! That invalidates AA." No, that proves that how this disease is cunning, baffling, powerful. It says, and you know, this is, you know, here's someone out of his mind, really, at the moment of death, and how natural to be asking for a drink. I think it's a beautiful conclusion. But during their lives, and Bill's especially, this recognition that in this group, the power comes from the ordinary members. Power flows upward. And others, you know, democracy supposedly works that way. You know, no, in a democracy we get the best government we can afford. I mean, this is the only institution which genuinely, it has not imposed anything on members. The great, I know we're going to talk about varieties at some point, but I think the unique, one of the many uniquenesses of AA is that there's this freedom, and there are no membership rules. And the others had membership rules, and eventually excluded everybody.
That democracy and that freedom really got tested in the 40s when AA went through, as you'd have written in your book, the explosive growth period and all the troubles local groups were experiencing. How do you describe the process out of which then emerged the traditions through the 1940s period and the importance of those?
Again, it's almost a providential thing. AA, the Big Book is published in 1939. AA sort of flourishes. Then we get into World War II, and this is a big deal. And then World War II ends, of course. I think we forget now, except those who are as old as I am, you know, the atomic power, the atomic bombs, which, you know, no one had even conceived of except for the physicists. We didn't understand, but we knew it was a new world. And then the soldiers come back. They'd wanted, because there'd been a depression, the idea was to demobilize slowly, else they're going to overwhelm the economy with all of these unemployed ex-servicemen. And it didn't work that way, because during the war years, people saved their money in savings bonds, and suddenly money was available, and they'd been unable to purchase consumer durables. No refrigerators were made in those years. No automobiles were made in the war years. And suddenly, the industry, which had really geared itself up and modernized itself to produce war materials, turns to producing consumer durables. The soldiers come back, being normal young men. They want to get married and start raising families, and they start exploding out into suburbia and building homes. And of course, as they're moving, those who are alcoholics, they start AA meetings wherever they go. Right. And there's this thing of everybody seems to think the best AA is where they came in. Well, you know, you get somebody from Vermont and somebody from Virginia who meet out in Missouri and decide to start AA, and they're going to have very different ideas of, you know, how to run AA. And I think the story originated then. The only thing you need to start an AA group is a pot of coffee, a big book, and one hell of a resentment. And you know, anybody who disagreed with the way, so they went off, and there were a lot of, they had, Bill once said that all the rules people submitted, no one would be able to qualify for as a member of AA. And so this again, this was providential, because there might have been the tendency to impose rules or to you know, who can and who cannot, and what you can do and what you cannot do. And it was just so totally unmanageable. A different kind of aspect of power. Impossible to manage, and Bill and the others realized this and didn't try to manage. Yeah. And so you had this tremendous variety. Earl T. of Chicago is credited with suggesting to Bill that out of this massive experience that was being gathered together by people and what they were hearing, maybe they could put together some what became the 12 traditions. Yeah. Such as, you know, the only requirement for membership is a sincere desire to stop drinking. And about 5 years later, they start saying, what does sincere mean? How do we decide who had a sincere? So they cut out that word. The only requirement for membership was a desire to stop drinking. But the traditions are to the fellowship what the steps are to the spirituality of the individual. Yeah. The tradition, there's a fellowship within, there's a spirituality within the fellowship. And that spirituality is fostered and safeguarded by those 12 traditions. This is AA's uniqueness, to go back to your earlier question, from these other groups. These other groups never produced something similar or the equivalent of AA's 12 traditions, whereas for AA, these traditions are just utterly protective.
Ernie, you've also talked about some of the close calls AA experienced particularly through the 40s, in terms of issues of money and professionalism and ego and clubhouse management and some of those, and the importance of the traditions in terms of surviving those.
This is how the traditions evolved. They found out what worked and what didn't work. It's interesting. It's the same way with the steps. People forget this. You know, some of the early members of AA came into, even before the steps were formally formulated, and they tried doing different things, and they didn't work, and they went out and drank again, and they died. And so, you know, we honor the people who came around and made it, and the old-timers, but part of what keeps members sober today was learned by people who drank again and went out and died, and those who were left behind said, oh, that doesn't work. And the same thing with the traditions. Some of these groups tried, you know, to do some of these things that they were suggesting, and they fell apart, or the members drank again. There was this one group down in Arkansas, you may remember the classic story. One of the AAs from Cleveland was traveling and stopped in on this group, and they found out at the meetings they had a big pitcher of beer on the table, and they drank beer throughout the meeting, and, you know, sort of wrote to AA saying, what shall we do about this? And basically, Bill's answer was, we don't have to do anything, the beer will take care of it. And when, when Father Ford was criticizing Bill for the fact that AA was an anarchy, there was no discipline in AA, Bill said, we have one great disciplinarian, John Barleycorn. And so, yes, some of the groups didn't go off on the deep end. In fact, this still happens. I mean, something recently in the Washington, D.C. area about a group that clearly has fallen away from the AA vision, and it's marvelous the way in which the fellowship is handling that, but there are groups that will go off, and when they get out beyond the traditions, everybody else sees how important the traditions are. Yeah. And the traditions were formed that way. Just as with the steps, they saw what part of how they discovered what worked was by observing what didn't work. And that's one reason for the power of the tradition. They are truly founded on experience.
You know, those traditions were also tested, if I can move us a little bit later, into the research years of the 70s when you were working on Not God, the explosive growth of treatment and sort of the influence and working at a relationship between treatment and AA. And people began to get concerned about, had we lost touch? Where was the real AA at? And you've written some about sort of the historical AA. Could you talk about that?
I always wince when I say real AA, but what started bothering me was professionals were saying, well, you know, what you describe is great, but that's not what happens here. I mean, that's not AA around here. And, you know, in my effort to bridge this, the varieties of AA is going to come in. There are these tremendous varieties of AA, and there are, especially in the era of treatment, counterfeits of AA. There's a possibility of confusing spirituality and therapy. And these are two good realities. But one is not the other. And if you mix the two and confuse them, they both suffer. And so as guidelines to, you know, professionals, you know, well, if you go around and you size up AA meetings, how do you know, what's a real AA meeting? I started to evolve these 5 things that will help you recognize real AA. And the first one is, if you're interested in all 5, the vocabulary that's used. In AA, they use the vocabulary of the steps. And so they talk about powerlessness, and they talk about inventory, and they talk about making amends, and this is the vocabulary. There are 200 words exactly in the 12 steps. Count them sometimes on one of those charts. And vocabulary is really centered around those words. If you go to a meeting and they're talking about being the child of an alcoholic or codependence or some of these esoteric, my psychiatrist told me my norepinephrine is not in balance. This might be marvelous, it might be helpful, it's not an AA meeting. In real AA, the language is the vocabulary of the steps, which is the vocabulary of spirituality, not of technology. As good as technology is, as important as therapy is, the two are distinct. And real AA uses the language, what Bill called the language of the heart, the language of recovery, the language of spirituality. Secondly, there's a prevalence of humor in AA. Non-alcoholics, this is the hardest thing they have to understand. What are these guys laughing at?
You told a great story about how when you were doing your research, you figured out where the AA, please tell that.
I started researching the Boston area, and of course a lot of the meetings were held in church basements, and you know, I got this meeting list, and I'd go to these, generally Catholic church, of course, large schools where there'd be these rooms, and I know that there was an AA meeting and an Al-Anon meeting both going on, I learned. And first I didn't know enough to come early. I mean, the important thing when you go to a meeting is to get there early. The important part of the meeting is before and after. But so I'd arrive a little bit late, I'd find a parking place, I'd wander in the hall, the doors would be closed. And how do I tell which one is AA and which one is Al-Anon? Very easy. I waited till I heard a burst of laughter. That was the AA room. Went in. There's not much to laugh about in the Al-Anon room. It's probably more difficult to be married to an alcoholic than to be an alcoholic. More difficult to love an alcoholic than to be an alcoholic. So this is not a criticism of Al-Anon at all. It's just the funniest thing, the greatest contribution of AA, humor is the juxtaposition of incongruities, the putting together of two things that don't belong together, the pompous person falling on a banana peel. There's no funnier combination of words in the English language than sober alcoholic. And stop and think. These two words before AA could not be used together. And this incongruity, alcoholics recognize the incongruity. This is part of how storytelling works. We cannot see ourselves. We cannot see our own incongruities. Storytelling holds up a mirror where we see. So you're not laughing at the person telling the story. You're laughing at glimpses of yourself that you get when the person is telling their story. Story is a mirror. And all stories are mirrors. This is one of those great literature. This is why Shakespeare and the classic literature, we recognize ourselves in it. The things that we didn't know.
So we have language and we have humor?
Humor. And one person I was consulting years after the book was published was telling me about meetings he was going to, and I said, well, at these meetings, do people tell they used to be like, what happened and what they are like now. And he said, well, we do some of that. Mostly we come in and we talk about, how we're feeling that day. Well, this is good. I mean, there are groups that are it's very important to go in and tell what you're experiencing, the way of emotion that day and all. But this is the format with an AA. We tell our stories. Our stories disclose in a general way. It says again in that How It Works chapter, what we used to be like, what happened, what we are like now, story style. Fourth is what we talked about just earlier, being loyal to the traditions. Mm-hmm. The reality that traditions are lived by, and especially maybe the traditions of non-affiliation, traditions about the use of money, self-support, the tradition of leadership is rotated. Our leaders are but trusted servants, various ways. So you probably have to stick around a while before you can tell that a group is following the traditions. This may not be an immediate litmus test, but I think that if you realize that tradition is being violated, it's a sign. It's like this is one of the things in the DC group we talked about. Sort of recognize early on there's something wrong here if you see a tradition being violated. Mm-hmm. And the last one I think is the most impossible one to emulate. The word community does not capture it. People are at AA meetings not because they want to be there, but because they need to be there. No one ever goes to AA because they want